thanks everybody for joining. This panel is talking about the other part of AI, which is what makes it work. And as Paul started out, he was talking about wins, words, images, numbers, sound. That's data. And Steve was talking about data ecosystem, data collaboration. So we're going to talk about data today, what makes it work. We're going to start at the top of the point of view of this whole initiative for the show, which is enterprise AI deployment. Let's start with you, Kim. What are we talking about? Let's unpack that. What does that mean, an enterprise AI deployment? How do we frame that? How do we understand that?
Well, I think that when you're looking at AI deployment and you're considering it, to be successful, you need to take a step back and think of it from how a product manager would think of it, instead of thinking of it as a project. And we're at that point where, to be successful, we do that switch over, which means that look at it from what is the business need that you can address that you couldn't have done without AI. Because at some point, no matter what anyone thinks, budgets will go away. So applying AI to, and in the course of us talking about data, is it something that we couldn't have done without AI, or that we are so much more efficient? And those are the starting points. I have many other views about that, but I think if we start with that and then apply that to, and what does that mean then for the data and how we're looking at data, I think that that's really important.
No, it's an interesting framing. So with any kind of technology, there's input, function, output. It's nice to keep it simple. So in this panel, we'll try to keep it simple and not get lost in terminology. So data is the input and the output here. And one of the questions is, what's strategic, what's tactical? That's what you're really talking about. Does it make sense? And a lot of that question begins with, can I get the data necessary to do this? I get asked questions that sometimes make me laugh. We were talking a little bit about that, Maher, which is, so is my data inside your model? How does that work? So we have a slide that you put together. I thought it'd be helpful for everybody just to unpack, what do we mean when we talk about data? Where is it coming from? Where is it going? Where does it live? Can you narrate?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is the diagram I showed earlier in my session today. Maybe I made some more updates to this where I added the guardrails when it comes to the input and the output data. So I think there is an education that has to happen over time with the generative AI becoming more popular and needed. Some of the questions we got as a business, Betterworks being a B2B business, is how they mix things between what is the model and what is the data. And they most of the time ask about, will our data, be leaving the firewalls of or the boundaries of your system, going into third party. So one of the topics we start thinking about before we prep for this session was identify the data that is kept in the ecosystem of the product and the data that it leaves and go to third party, and what kind of firewalls you need to have, or like process and security has to be set in place for that to work. So going through this diagram very quickly, we identify three types of data that is used in generative AI. The common data that is used to train these big models originally, so what takes a random model to become a popular LLM that is used, either open source or private. So all that data is most of the time kind of unlabeled data, big corpus of text data, crawl data, and so on. And then on top of that kind of pre-training, there's data that is used to align to make these models really talk and do the things they expect them. Like if you want to build a chatbot, that's where you kind of fine-tune and make it respond as a chatbot. Otherwise, you get raw kind of predict the next word aspect of the models. And then focus more on the enterprise use cases. So the enterprise data that you as a company that is building integration with generative AI might need or might have is data for fine-tuning. If you are building a model, you need to kind of train for the specific task you have in mind. You need data to fine-tune the model. This could be labeled data that is very specific, small set compared to the initial data used for training. training, and then that data will train your model to be better at that specific task. There is also, if you use techniques like RAGs or in-context learning, you need some other set of data. Most of the time for RAG is the knowledge data, is really the production data of your system. So it's sitting there in some form of shape. Most of the time you call them like the vector DBs or graph DBs or even regular relational DBs. This data too will be used if you want to kind of infuse it as part of your inputs to the model so you can get better outcomes. And then last but not least, the user data. And I think this is where most of the discussion about data happens to be, is what is the input the user is given to the model, what outputs they get, and how we manage these outputs mainly. Do we use them to make decisions? And I think we had conversations about this today, what kind of logs you can and you cannot keep. And I want to go back to the sessions from earlier because I was about to bring up the EU AI Act. Betterworks, we work with global customers, enterprise customers, and some of our European customers bring this on a kind of a recurrent basis. About the outputs of the models and what kind of the data that comes out of that, and are we making any decision using this data? Are we influencing? Is this data bias? Are the initial models trained? What kind of data these initial models are trained on, and do they contain bias? So to be able to serve our customers, we really need to dig deeper into understanding every piece of data we have and the flow of the data and how the users will interact with it. I'll take a break here and let other people talk about this.
Yeah, Kim has a thought.
I think one of the most important things with this diagram, one of the most important takeaways is that you've created what that framework is and that need for that framework. It's that thinking ahead of time and asking those questions of what is the appropriate type of data for this? What is the regulatory that we'll need for this? It's all the things that, and that's why I was talking about it, switching from being a project to being a product, is that you need to think about those things ahead of time. And once you have this type of framework, then being able to apply it becomes an outline of, if we're using our own data, it means this.
Yeah.
And as opposed to every moment, every new project being how do we get this done? Because then we'll never deploy.
Yeah. So when Steve came up and his title is Data-Driven Business and AI, you can't separate those two things. They are two sides of the same coin. So when we're talking about this flow, we're talking about access, permission, which is governance. Matt, why don't you step everybody through and unpack what does governance mean and how does it apply?
What I think is interesting about governance, and I can see everyone's heads go back down to their phones when we talk about governance, because it's not a fun topic, right? Because the intersection of people, process, and technology, it's the hard part. It's the process that you have to engineer around people, and technology only sort of comes in at the end. But where I think governance is so important and is because it is the intersection, as Jake, I think, so succinctly put it, between data and cyber that makes or breaks successful production deployments. Data gets you to successful POCs, cyber gets you to successful production. And it's not necessarily a technical thing. You have to define the guardrails before you implement them. I love talking tech, I love talking about APIs, and I love talking about structure, but it is only when we start putting intelligent policies in place does it allow us to accelerate the development velocity of AI models or applications. And I'll say one more thing before I bore everyone to tears on this topic, but the organizations that are going to be wildly successful with generative AI and these techniques are those that have eaten their vegetables. When you're talking about Matt, I have a 10-year-old who doesn't like to eat vegetables. He likes to eat sugar. But in order to grow up strong and healthy, he needs to eat his vegetables, and he doesn't like it. And I think that's true of governance in most enterprises. A lot of enterprises don't like it because you can't really say, ooh, that governance policy made us X amount of money. Or that governance policy, maybe you could say it saved us some money because it prevented something, but it's hard to allocate budgets for that. So I think the organizations that have eaten their vegetables up to this point, whether we're talking data governance, whether we're talking intelligent policies, those have been invested in cyber, those are the ones that are going to be wildly successful as the dust settles from a technical perspective. And so my guidance is, if you haven't eaten your vegetables yet, get on it. I think practically speaking, that's going to make or break wild success.
Yeah, it's a good framing. Enterprise data is also not a singular thing.
Yeah.
Right? There's a plurality, and big global organizations have their data spread all over the place. So governance is not in any one plane, it's in every plane. So Nikesh, this is something that I think probably touches your every single day. And when we were listening to your talk earlier, which was great, by the way, I really enjoyed it, you had a couple of frames. You said, hey, well, theoretically, we're pretty advanced given what we're trying to do. Operationally, not so much. This has a lot to do with governance. Can you expand on that? Tell us what it's like to deal with these challenges inside and what you're doing to overcome them.
Okay. How much time do we have? All right. Sorry. So many thoughts, and I think kind of great framing, right? So like the eat your vegetables analogy is really great in terms of what I think organizations need to do to kind of get that correct. Unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to think about it, we are dealing with enterprise data, right? Large organizations, data is in different places. Even if it's in one place, it's thought about very differently from a silo perspective. And I think organizations honestly are on a journey, right? So we've seen this wave in analytics, every so many years, right? It's like you go from a central group to a distributed group, back to this. I think we'll see this with data science as well. And that's really kind of driving some of this data governance conversations, right? So I benefit because right now I sit within the technology group at Stanford Healthcare, and we're positioned to support both the School of Medicine and the hospital. And so because I sit where I sit, I can say, I need the information, you need to give it to me. There are operational groups which can't do that, right? And for very valid reasons. And I think it's an interesting time in the organizations as to like, how are we going to proceed, right? So if we can set our data governance right in a way that enables the entire organization to work with the data, that'd be great, because what are we seeing now? Like, even if you look at sports, right? Like, how much statistics do you see on sports? Like any game you watch, right? Data is in our blood now. Like it's in our culture. So why are we locking it up and not letting our workforces be able to do cool things with it? At the same time, we also have to kind of keep in mind, right? Regulations, governance, those are there for a reason. We need to kind of get that balance correct. And I don't know what the right answer is. I think certain businesses will be able to do it much faster than other businesses. At a place like ours, the mission is very different, right? We have three very distinct missions. They don't always agree, right? We have a research mission, we have an education mission, and we're a health system. And so, like, it's hard for those. There's always going to be conflicts there, healthy conflicts, but we see a lot of things there that are not straightforward to answer.
Yeah, you have a comment?
Yeah, there were so many good nuggets in this afternoon's keynote around these topics, and one of the ones that I really enjoyed was when he spoke about application integration has not fundamentally changed from at least a design perspective since the 90s, probably even before that. This before my time. But what I think we can look to here is good architectures for having solved this when we didn't have the speed and the connectivity that we have now. When compute wasn't cheap, we can look to some of those architectures around this, right? So another story was around the AI that jailbreaked itself out of a VM. Well, if you put good cyber around that will never happen. But someone has to define a policy that says you're never going to do that. And someone needs the AI resources. If you have an AI that you give it the permissions to do that, of course it's going to do that. So we like to think of Gen AI as this novel technology phenomenon, but it's just a component that's been built on other techniques and other paradigms. And so we can just look back even just a few years and look at good architectures around big data or data science or machine learning. These things all build on top of each other. And then if you start to synthesize good cyber architectures with good application development architectures, all of a sudden the problem's not that daunting. Yeah, okay, your compute load might be a little bigger and your inferencing at the edge might be a little more important, but again, these problems have been reasonably solved, so let's treat this space as not something that's completely novel, but just an iteration on previous techniques and architectures.
Yeah, there's an interesting convergence. So we talk about digital transformation, AI is part of that. Most large organizations have a junk closet of data because the artifacts of digital transformation is a lot of digital stuff. It's not highly organized, it's not indexed, there's no metadata, people don't know what's there. What we do know is that the most valuable data is typically the most sensitive data. Right? And so the most strategic types of AI applications in the enterprise will require sensitive data. And the other interesting artifact of digital transformation is that most large enterprises have deconstructed their own business. They have outsourced and partnered for functions, and the partners, they're ecosystem partners, as Steve pointed out. They have the data you need. So let's talk a little bit about that. One is being able to make useful data. How do you overcome that challenge when you don't always know what you have? The second is, what if you don't have the data you need for your initiative and it's outside your organization, how you're going to go about dealing with that? Why don't you pick that up, Maher, because I know you deal with this.
Yeah, I have a very strong thought about this. So again, I think one of the use cases of the data in an enterprise B2B space in this case is that the most important data is the most sensitive data. So if we can leverage that data in many ways, we can build better systems overall. The challenge that comes with HR tech data is you cannot you leverage that information. So yes, we're sitting on a gold mine of data, very valuable. We can only use it to create better user experiences, advanced insights, but we cannot use it to train and improve the AI over time. So we cannot fine-tune the models using the production data we have. And that's for many reasons. Being a multi-tenant SaaS enterprise solution, we don't have access to that data. So the other alternatives are obviously the other techniques out there. Instead of fine-tuning, maybe do other techniques, and the most popular one being RAG and context learning, but also to look into synthetic data as an alternative. Really find a way to maybe learn from the production data you have, but also go and seek synthetic data that might help you fine-tune and optimize your models to become better over time. We're trying to collect some insights and feedback about the performance of our models, but again, we cannot use the input and the generated output as a way to fine-tune future models.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. You have thoughts on this?
I do. I have a topic and a adjacent, which is one of the things you talked about was the amount of data that comes from what we already have. One of the things that, and you've talked about large enterprise, one of the things that even for a medium-sized or even small enterprise is the fact of I've found that when you figure out exactly what type of data you need, you may not need as much as you think you need. And that defining it is really important to be able to move faster, as opposed to, I have this closet of a lot of information, I only need these pieces. A fallacy that I hear repeated is, it's the organizations that have a ton of data, and you're going to need so much data. And it's now been proven that when you have the right data, you need less pieces of that. And so that knowing what that is or defining what that is. And then the second part, and this comes from whether it's your internal or whether you're pulling from a third party, is there are now solutions that will work on how do I define across different organizations. So it means, we're using this term here, the third party is using this term, but they mean the same thing. a little bit of ASL for anyone who speaks ASL, but that you're having that, that it means the same thing, and you end up being able to take advantage and use data across data from different data sources if you can define what it is.
Yeah. There's an interesting, in my work, there's a lot of work just to prepare data, to use data, and which seems a little ridiculous, but it's true. Discovery of the data that you have and what data might be operable for a particular enterprise initiative is important. It's a hard job. How do you and some of your customers deal with that? Matt?
Well, it's interesting. You got me thinking, actually, like, to sort of to indirectly answer this. When you were talking about data across, I sort of thought the data mesh pattern. And this was all the rage a few years ago. And I mean, we could just do a show of hands. How many organizations have actually implemented a proper data mesh? But you don't have to put up your hands. But like this idea around, do you have enough? How is it used? How do you train with it? Can you bring synthetic in? And this idea of building a product for that, again, harping back to my earlier point, that if you've gotten good at that, then building AI products actually won't be that difficult. But if you haven't done that hard work, if you didn't have a catalog in your warehouse back in the day, you're going to really struggle with metadata management today, and then being able to describe how did that prompt come up with that answer. If you can't reproduce it, you've really put your organization at risk. And I know we're very tangential to the question here, but
no, it's not. It's really the point is that it's what part of the elephant you're touching.
Yeah.
That's the part that you're dealing with, and it's a big elephant, and it's complicated. One of the other parts of the challenge is bias. So how do you know if your data is actually biased so that input, function, output concept, garbage in, garbage out, you have to deal with this. Garbage, typically we think of it as quality, cleanliness. That's what Steve was talking about. Several other people were talking about that. But there's also bias. How do you detect it? How do you know it's there? So part of this, we've talked about the term guardrails. That's been used a lot. I think a good takeaway for the team here, everybody listening, would be to understand what is that. So it's a little bit beyond don't talk Klingon to the chat bot, right? What does it mean? What is a guardrail? And what does that cover? And the hierarchy of sophistication 1 through 6, that was one of the columns. What does it mean to you, Nikesh, when you're working with sensitive healthcare data?
Sorry, many different thoughts. Again, so I'll say, again, when we say guardrails, a little bit about what we mean, and just a big caveat: field's moving really fast, so there's lots of things going on, right? So when we're talking about our guardrails, we're really thinking about, again, kind of this idea of like, what is your penalty for being wrong, or how often can you afford to be wrong, right? Like really understanding what that is and kind of making sure that we're staying within that lane currently until we can get some better guidance, whether it's clinical, whether it's regulatory, law, policy, et cetera, right? So a lot of things as we think about Gen AI type work, for example, we'll really kind of say, what can we do which has a human in the loop or has a way of, you're not making a clinical decision yet on it, or it's not an automated decision. That helps us to get started, because half of the challenge here is also just how do we just get started, right? The learnings that you're going to get aren't going to come by just waiting. You have to be able to kind of do some of the pieces as you're going along, and so that's how we're using the term guardrails right now. When we think about it, but the real key that it's on my wish list, and I know people are working on it, is two pieces, right? So for clinical decisions, if it's predictive, just the amount of evidence you need through prospective studies is really large to convince a physician to start using it, or it's got to be the first, one of the top 5 things they're looking in their guidelines. When you're thinking generative right now, a lot of the evaluations we see, right, are like, can you pass this exam? Can you, kind of look at that? But what we need to be able to do is say, how well can you do on these type of tasks, whether clinical, medical, operational, what does that look like? Yeah. And that research is happening. Yeah. It's not out yet, but we're excited about that coming out.
So one way of thinking about guardrails relates to thresholds. right? Thresholds of quality, reliability, explainability. What are some other contexts?
I mean, obviously, HR is a big place for where safeguards are very important. So a few use cases we had and faced at Betterworks were mainly where you're trying to give feedback to someone, as an example, and we're using generative AI to help you give the best feedback you can. But sometimes AI can find these kind of unconscious bias in the feedback you're trying to send. So the LLM role is to help you build better kind of feedbacks and better communication, actionable, and so on. Where we are adding safeguards is in between the user and the LLM on two fronts, the input and the output. So if you're adding or given any content that has some sort of again, bias in it or anything that could be offensive to others, the safeguards job is to get that as soon as possible and respond back sorry, I cannot help you with this one. We're not even trying to resolve that for you. We're just going to stop there. And same thing with the LLMs. So these LLMs, because they are kind of unpredictable at some sort of level, so they might give some response that could be biased based on the bias that was originally in the data that was used to train the model.
Right.
And that's where, again, as being in a space that is very highly compliant, some of the questions coming from our customers is what data was used to train the models. And because we don't build our own models, we need to investigate and look into every one of these models that we're bringing to understand exactly how it's used. So the safeguard now on the way of the input from the LLM will check if there is any bias that was coming through the pre-training data set and preventing that from going to the end user again.
That's interesting.
There's one other place that we're using guardrails, which is guardrails related to what somebody is able to do. So I'm authorized to do something, making sure that the LLM or the co-pilot or AI assistant is not going beyond what I was allowed to do. So the guardrails are how far can the AI go on its own?
Interesting. Matt?
I think the domain needs to be taken into account as well, because in healthcare, you miss a diagnosis with this, it's life-changing, literally. You play chess with a chatbot. It's not that big of a deal, especially if you've gotten millions of savings with the chatbot. So I think taking the domain into account when we think about how much we need to put in, again, I liken back to how many nines do we need in terms of our resiliency. Every extra 9 is an order of magnitude of cost more. So when we think about guardrails, what's the scope of the problem, right? How many 9s do we need for our guardrails here?
Yeah, there's this thought about autonomous AI. There's this idea that AI will operate independent of human factors or a human in the loop, which really boils down to trust. And so if we go back to this very simple paradigm of input, function, output, how do you deal with trust? Shana, former speaker, former moderator, she brought up this topic of zero trust, which for those who don't know means you're not trusting based on some subsequent verification. The supposition is that none of the actors, nobody is trustworthy, and you have to protect against that. So how do you integrate this notion of trust in the output, since it's so important if we're going to have autonomous agents, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think two things Betterworks is focused on adding and kind of maintaining over time. First one is transparency, like how this whole thing works, what's behind the scenes, what data is used to train and all of that. And I think honestly, the part of our website that was the most updated recently is our privacy policies in terms of kind of use. These get updated on a daily basis. The second thing is explainability. So when you have an outcome coming from the LLM, in every request we do, we ask the LLM to explain what it's doing, so we can expose that to the end user so they know exactly what's happening. And that's where we have a little bit of a wiggle room in terms of like how many 9s. Yeah. So even if the LLM is given something not fully accurate, at least the explanation will expose that. And as an end user, you can decide if you take that or leave it.
Yeah. So to wrap up, since we have 45 seconds and I just got the hook from David over there, one thing to take away. There's a lot of design thinking that has to go into these kinds of initiatives. You can't start from the bottom and work up. You have to start from the endpoint you seek and work backwards to see, do you have access to the data you need? Is it governed? Will it need guardrails? What type of applications or initiatives? What level of human support? This has a lot less to do with the AI and a lot more to do with the data that drives it. And that was the whole theme of today's session. I hope it was useful. Hope it was informative. Thank you very much.